Thank you very much for being with us today. We are here with Professor François Crépeau, who is a full professor of public international law at McGill University. Between 2011 and 2017, Professor Crépeau was also United Nations Special Rapporteur on the human rights of migrants. And so our conversation with him will focus on the root causes and typologies of gender-based violence in the context of migration. So welcome and thank you for being with us today.
Thank you for inviting me.
I wanted to start with a general question more on the root causes. We know that gender-based violence can be a key factor throughout the migration process. It can be a determinant for the causes and consequences of migration, but also a key element in human rights violations. Mm-hmm. So in your experience, what are the main root causes and the typologies of gender-based violence throughout migration processes?
Mm-hmm. Root causes is a concept that was primarily discussed in the field of refugee issues, and it has been a conversation that has existed for now 30 years. It is a conversation about why do people move? Why do people move forcibly in the case of refugees? And why do people move in the case of migrants not so forcibly? The identifying root causes implies that people move because they have no other choice. And they find that mobility is a better solution than staying put. Root causes have been identified as generally being encompassed in two terms: violence and deprivation, destitution, lack of economic opportunities. In the violence context, we know that sexual violence is endemic in any type of armed conflict. But we also have, in societies that are not in the context of an armed conflict, we also have sexual violence. We have sexual violence in all countries of the world. In some countries it is better repressed than in others, but in some countries it's not at all repressed. It is part of the daily life of men and women of those countries. There has been a push by civil society, international organizations, to recognize that gender-based violence in the absence of state action should actually be considered as a human right violation sufficient to be called persecution in the sense of refugee law. And therefore, women in particular, who are victim of violence and the police doesn't do anything or laughs or tell them to go back to their husbands, would be in a position to ask for refugee status. Now, this, for example, is something that Jeff Sessions in the United States last week denounced as not being persecution, and they adopted, it seemed, a regulation yesterday that prohibited the providing refugee status based on gender-based violence. So there is a pushback against this more liberal approach to refugee status determination, encompassing human rights violations that were not envisaged as part of persecution when the convention was adopted in 1951. What is now being also more and more recognized is that gender-based violence is part of the whole migration cycle. It's part of the reasons why people leave, either because of violence or because of deprivation. It is part of the journey through a number of transit countries. We know, for example, that many women from let's say, Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, west coast of Africa and even East Africa, are actually taking contraception before leaving, knowing full well that this is going to happen, and repeatedly, and therefore taking precautions. And this is a sociological account. They do that because they know, they're well informed, and they accept, in quotation marks, but they accept that this will be part of the journey and it's a price to pay to get the objective which they wish, being to escape that situation, to set foot in a country where they're protected, and in a country where themselves and their children can establish roots, new roots, and create a future for themselves. And so we know that. And we also know that upon arrival in the host country, gender-based violence can continue. One, they can find themselves in communities where gender-based violence is rife and the police hasn't had time yet to figure out what is going on, or they can find themselves in trafficking rings. Very often their vulnerability through the process, through the migration process, makes them prey to trafficking rings. It's a small number as compared to the number of migrants, but it is a definite possibility. And also the fact that many of them will find themselves with a very precarious status in the country of destination, either because they will be undocumented or because they will have a very precarious legal status. If they have, for example, a one-year permit renewable for a single employer who has to be determined in advance, what we call a sponsorship mechanism or kafala system in the Middle East. Well, if they're fired, they lose the residence permit and the work permit, they have to go back home. The investment they've made, psychologically, physically, monetary-wise, is so, and the fact that their family is counting on them, is so huge that they won't do anything to put at risk the migration project. And this means that if there is sexual harassment or sexual violence against them, let's think about domestic workers, for example, who live in the house of their employer, they might not denounce it because that would threaten the migration project. They might not fight it. They might just, say, this is part of winning a future, of gaining a future for myself and for my children, and I just live with that until they can't accept it anymore. And then very often they're sent packing and they lose everything they have accumulated, because very often they don't have to go to the bank, etc. And they go back home empty-handed with plenty of debts to repay. And this is the kind of scenario where precariousness, the constructed precariousness in which migrants are often placed, put them at risk. And we, destination states, are not protecting these people.
I wanted to follow up on a point that you mentioned about the failure to report, or like the decision not to report that somebody has been subject to gender-based violence, because this also doesn't help us to identify the magnitude of gender-based violence. I was wondering if you have knowledge of examples of good practices, first of all, to detect when gender-based violence has happened, and second, good examples of protection for survivors of gender-based violence.
Well, yes, it depends on the state, on the authorities, and on the social networks in the society, in the country you're in. In many countries of transit, Libya being probably the worst at present, there's very little one can do because the social networks are not there. The authorities are part of the problem rather than the solution. In European countries, there's a lot more that can be done. Also in the host countries, a lot more that can be done. There are very good initiatives, for example, for fighting trafficking in persons, especially for sexual purposes, but also for labor purposes in the Netherlands and Denmark, etc. Several countries have established mechanisms for providing a longer-term visa for victims of trafficking. One-year visas, renewable. Certain countries have tried to make that conditional upon collaborating with the authorities at the prosecution of the traffickers. Most countries have recognized that the conditionality actually doesn't work and that it is creating another precariousness which is not necessary. These women have to rebuild their lives inside themselves and then in relation to the outside world, and they need time, and they need services, they need care, they need to be able to get back on their feet and think about the future. And there are plenty of examples where NGOs have been enlisted, specialists, psychiatric, psychological care specialists, etc. So this exists. It costs something, it needs an organization, it needs to be, and states are a bit reluctant to provide such things because they always fear, and it's always the answer we hear, they fear that, oh, this will act as a pull factor, more women will come because we treat them well, and so we need to reduce those services. So we have this counterproductive narrative that is often used. But there are quite good examples. We have quite good examples of NGOs in the field who are able to shelter these women, give them time to think, give them time to build trust, create a rapport, tell the stories. But this is what is most missing in migration policies generally, is that what is necessary is individualized analysis of the situation of that person, specific care to respond to that specific situation, and solutions that are specially tailored to that person. That's what we do in social work. Social workers try to create a life plan, help people with their budgets if they're not happy, if they can't deal with a budget, help them school their children, help them educate their children. Depending on what the problem is, social workers will bring types of solutions that are very different, establishing life plans. This is what we should do with migrants. We should not say, oh, all the irregular migrants should go back home. No. We should say, okay, what is the problem with Maria? What is the problem with Juan? And to find for each of them the appropriate solution. And for people who have been victim of gender-based violence, it means counseling, it means communicating with family, helping them communicate with family, helping them tell their story, helping them rebuild. But that has to be individualized. And most countries don't want to do that. Most host countries don't want to do that for people that they have not selected abroad. They don't want to do that because they fear this will be a pull factor. Now, for countries who have programs to select refugees abroad in refugee camps or in conflict situations, and select them to give them some form of permanent residence, then very often, and this would be Australia, Canada, New Zealand, the US, then often there are programs, because these people will be permanent residents, therefore they will become citizens. And we want to provide them with appropriate care, etc. But for people who came undocumented, who were discovered by the police, arrested, detained, the needs are the same, the services should be the same, but states are often saying, well, we don't want this person to stay. So she can rebuild her life as much as she wants, but not here. So providing services is a way for her to create roots, and we don't necessarily want that. And so this is part of the difficulties. We have several narratives that are conflicting. The human rights narrative that says we should protect people, but the anti-immigration narrative that says we should send them back home.
Thank you very much also for reminding us that migrants are not numbers. They are Juan, they are Maria. They need to have our support and our protection on an individual basis as individual human beings. Is there a final message that you would like to give to our audience?
Well, I just wanted to say that we consider normal that people in one of our city who doesn't find a job in that city moves to another city. Europe has made it a rule that if you can't find a job in your country, you can move to another country within Europe. And in the Schengen zone in particular, you have a much freer movement. Why do we do that? Because we find that people are the best placed to find by themselves the place where they will strive, where they will find an employer, where they will find a partner, where they will be able to put their kids to school, to university. People do these decisions very well by themselves, and we do these decisions in our lives very well. We would be surprised if the government came and said, no, you need to move to this city because your children will be schooled better over there. We wouldn't accept that. I don't see why it would be different in terms of international migration. For sure, we cannot open the borders and from one day to the next and say, okay, open borders, whatever. But I think it should be the plan that mobility should be facilitated, and we should plan long in advance. We should tell ourselves, okay, in 20 years from now, in 2038, we should have free mobility through borders re-established as it was in the 60s and 50s and 60s and 70s. We should re-establish that. It doesn't mean that you're not controlled at borders, but it means that you have the papers to enter, either visa, electronic travel authorization, or whatever mechanism provided, or absence of visa if you have visa liberalization, but people should be able to move, to look for work, etc. And then to provide facilitation for change of status. You meet someone, you find a job, why would you prevent an employer to take as an employee for all sorts of reasons someone who comes from elsewhere? It can be to the advantage of the business because this person speaks, let's say, Spanish, and that could open, the Latin American market, etc. Let people make those decisions, and they will integrate by themselves. The law needs to be applied. If the person cannot find a job, that means that that person may not have the right to stay. But we should facilitate human interactions as much as possible and recognize that it's part of the dignity of human beings to make choices for themselves. So there's an equilibrium here between state decisions, but the first rule should be respect the dignity of people to make choices for themselves.
Sure, thank you. Thank you very much for your inspirational testimony, and thanks to our viewers for their being with us.
Thank you.